I'm all for a simple landscape, but sometimes my paintings feel like they need a little something. So today we're going to work through 3 different ways to add sheep to your watercolor landscapes. I've started out by painting this group of 3 standing in a few different positions, and this is just going to be a reference for myself. And the sheep in today's painting will be much smaller, but I like to have something to glance at just to make sure I'm happy with my overall shapes and placement of the heads and legs, regardless of the size. So for the first painting, I'm going to use liquid resist. I recommend having a dedicated paintbrush for this step. Even after rinsing, the drawing gum tends to leave the bristles sticky and clumped together. So what I'm doing is I'm placing a series of dots scattered throughout the field. I'm not worried about precise shapes or sizes, but I do try to make sure the dots are slightly smaller in the distance and larger in the foreground. This will take a few minutes to dry, so we're going to move on to painting number 2. And for this one, we're going to need a piece of tissue paper or a paper towel. And I'm just throwing down a very quick background, just so we have something to work with. I'm using aquamarine for the sky, and this is a color I've really been enjoying lately for my skies. For so long I was sort of stuck with cerulean blue, just reaching for that one all the time, but I finally branched out and found that there are other shades that I really like for that sky. And actually even using a mix of the 2 blues can be really nice. Okay, now I'm rolling up the tip of my paper towel so it's quite small. And what I'm going to do is just dab. So I'm dabbing, lifting away some of that greenish yellow that I just put down. If your paper is still fairly wet, your colors will bleed back in to fill that hole, so you might need to come back and dab a second time. Just make sure you get it before the paint dries because it's much easier to lift this way. And by the way, you might have used that last technique for clouds. It's a technique that I really love for adding clouds in just such a simple way. And I'll link a video here that shows an example of that, how to use a paper towel or a tissue for easy watercolor clouds. So as you can see, we're already well into the 3rd painting. And for this one, I'm going to be using white gouache to create the flock of sheep. And so I want my field to be much darker. I find that I like using gouache when I can get more of a contrast. I've just never had much luck with white gouache over light colors and values. So this last section here is where the sheep will be. So I will be adding quite a bit more color here so I can make sure it's dark enough. I'm going to be experimenting with adding other animals to paintings, cows, horses, and maybe even wild animals in forest scenes. So please consider subscribing if you'd like to see those videos in the future. Okay, it feels like the liquid resist is dry, so I'll just drop in my sky, a single hill, and the field. When it comes to my main palette, and especially when I'm painting landscapes, I have 3 go-to greens. So I use Perline green, Hooker's green, and Undersea green. And so I would love to hear if you guys have any favorite greens that you are just always reaching for. And I also really like using turquoise, but just mixed in very, very small amounts. Burnt sienna and raw sienna are 2 others that I really like mixing with my greens. Okay, that should just about do it for backgrounds. So now we are about to get into the really fun part. Let's turn these marshmallows into sheep. So to add some shadows and form to the bodies, I like to use a color either in the gray or brown range, titanium gray, titanium buff, or a very light value of bloodstone genuine. I would say it depends on personal preference as well as what you feel would look best for your background colors. And today I'm going to be using Bloodstone Genuine. I'm mainly focused on the bottom of my blobs and slightly up the side. And remember, we want variety, like the reference image. It would be a little creepy for the painting if we had an entire flock just standing upright, gazing directly at the viewer. Although maybe that's what you're going for, a dozen or so sheep staring deep into your soul. That is definitely something to consider. And adding the faces, or the heads rather, I'm going for an oval-like shape narrowing towards the bottom, with a tiny flap sticking out from each side for the ears. And for some angles, the ears won't be visible, or maybe just one ear will be. And the same goes for the legs. Sometimes we will see only 2 legs or 3, or the legs might kind of blend together. It's all about that variety. And you'll notice that for this step, I've darkened my values. I'm using a thicker and darker consistency of Bloodstone Genuine for the heads and the legs. Watch out for this fluffy guy in front here. He is definitely going to stare into your soul. And now to finish off this painting, I have a light value of green on my brush, and I've dabbed my brush off on a paper towel, so I'm not going to bring in too much water, which would cause unwanted blooms. I'm dragging my brush across the paper under the sheep. This will accomplish a few different things. It creates the look of shadow and texture, and it adds more interest to an otherwise drab-looking field, but it also does something else that's really cool. It softens the bottom of the feet, bringing the grass and the sheep together, anchoring the animals in a way to the earth. See how they look like they're floating a little bit less now? And I'm just throwing in a blade of grass here and there, and we're done. Okay, on to the next one. I'm using a rolling motion to gather the bits of drawing gum. And now we have these little wonderful clean spots of untouched paper, and we can repeat that process with the sheep. Starting out once again with the shading and forming of the body, just the lightest values needed here. And you see how I've made some super teeny tiny little spots in the background? And this is to demonstrate how the smallest sheep in the background don't need much work at all. Just a little speck of color for the head is really all it takes. By themselves, the sheep in the far distance might not look like anything specific, but thanks to the closest sheep with their recognizable shapes, the viewer will easily understand that this is a flock of sheep, regardless of the absolute lack of detail in the distance. And not only are my sheep larger in the front of this painting, but I'm making sure my values are darker the closer they are. And this one is facing sideways, so only 2 of his legs will be seen. And you'll see that quite often the heads of the sheep are actually like way down low, almost in their bodies, instead of sticking way up high like a horse's head would. And that was kind of a weird way to put it, but I think you know what I mean. And like before, I'm coming through with that light, damp green, softening and anchoring. We are not going to let these sheep float away. On to the final painting. As you can see, it's a lot lighter now that it's dry, but I think we'll have enough contrast to make this work. So I've loaded my brush up with white gouache, a very thick consistency. And paying attention to size versus placement, I'll paint in a handful of fluffy sheep. And I already have a feeling I'm going to want a second layer of gouache. So I'm going to hold off on the shadows for now, and I'll just be jumping straight into the legs. White gouache usually looks so bright and crisp when you first apply it, but kind of like traditional watercolors, it fades as it dries. I don't use white gouache often, but when I do, it's almost always going to be at least 2 layers for my own liking. All these headless sheep look so funny right now. It's like a bunch of white beetles crawling around on the grass. For a long time, with all my landscape paintings, I just stuck with the most basic of layouts, just a couple hills or mountains, some trees, some grass, and then maybe if I was feeling really brave, I might throw in some flowers. But I don't know why, for so long I steered clear of any animals, any sort of buildings, and so now it's really exciting to just be venturing out a little and adding more things to my paintings. And I would say that I have commissions to thank for that. I've had so many commission pieces that have challenged me way beyond what I would have ever taken on myself. So that has been just a great learning experience for me. And brushing in the grass now. And you can really see how much that white has faded. So I'm going to be adding an extra touch on each sheep. It will look really bright when we first get the white on there, but remember, just like before, it will fade. And actually, before I do that, I'm just going to add a little bit more color to a few of the faces, just the close-up ones, darken them up a bit. Oh yeah, that looks bright. But it will fade, and I think it'll be just about where we want it. Okay, I know this next part is really hard to see on film, but I have just the smallest amount of the faded Bloodstone Genuine just to come in with the shadows. And the white is still wet, but I'm okay with that because it sort of bleeds up in a natural way and just blends together. And once I remove the tape in a moment here, I'll see if I can get a close-up so we can take a better look at that. So there we have it, watercolor sheep 3 ways. Let me know which technique you like the best, the liquid resist, the color lifting method, or adding white gouache. I would say my favorite was definitely the color lifting up in the top right corner. I seem to get the best results from that one. Although the gouache does add sort of like a fluffy texture, which is kind of cool. So let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.